In the sterile, climate-controlled corridors of Outpost 73, holding a piece of curved brass was a faster way to die than pointing a loaded plasma rifle at a Federation guard. Humanity had lost a great deal of its heritage when the Galactic government intervened to establish absolute universal order. But the most dangerous contraband left in the cosmos was a simple acoustic vibration. The Federation valued logic, symmetry, and above all, absolute silence. Their empire spanned 1,000 star systems held together by an infinite energy grid that demanded perfect structural harmony. To the governing council, Earth's musical history was not art. It was classified as a Class A biological hazard. To hum a melody in a public sector was a severe misdemeanor. To possess an unpowered analog instrument like an acoustic guitar was a capital offense punishable by immediate atmospheric ejection. Elias Thorne made a very comfortable living breaking that specific law, deep in the underbelly of the outpost, in a cargo bay that smelled faintly of ozone and recycled synthetic nutrients. Elias stood beside a scarred metal shipping crate. He was a human who looked exactly like a man who spent his life dodging planetary blockades. His boots were scuffed, his leather jacket bore the scorch marks of near misses, and his eyes held a dangerous spark of defiance mixed with practiced charm. Across from him stood a wealthy, trembling merchant from the Synthetica system, a being composed mostly of cybernetic implants and nervous energy. The merchant kept scanning the shadows, his optical sensors whirring loudly. Elias patted the heavy velvet-lined case resting on the crate. He unlatched the oxidized silver clasps with agonizing slowness, letting the tension build. He opened the lid to reveal the prize. Resting on the crushed red velvet was a vintage tenor saxophone. The golden brass was slightly tarnished but beautifully engraved, catching the dim industrial light of the cargo bay. The merchant gasped, a synthesized sound of pure awe. He reached out a trembling metallic appendage, afraid to actually touch the artifact. Elias smiled, leaning against the crate. He knew exactly how to sell a piece of history. He told the merchant it was forged in a lost human city called Paris, long before the Federation decided that the universe needed to be quiet. He explained that it did not plug into a neural port, it possessed no digital interface, and it required no power core. It required human breath, raw lungs, and the messy, chaotic emotion of a living creature to function. The merchant calculated the risk, his optical lenses dilating. The black market value of a functional analog instrument was staggering. Wealthy collectors across the galaxy paid planetary ransoms just to look at them behind stasis fields, desperate to feel a connection to a time before the Federation sanitized existence. Before the merchant could transfer the digital credits, the shadows at the edge of the cargo bay vanished. High-intensity floodlights snapped on, blinding them both in a harsh, clinical white glare. A voice cut through the air, completely devoid of inflection, modulation, or warmth. Step away from the resonant anomaly. Elias did not flinch. He slowly raised his hands, keeping his signature smirk firmly in place. Out of the glare stepped Inquisitor Kalen, flanked by 4 heavily armored Federation enforcers carrying charged plasma rifles. Kalen belonged to the Oriole species. She was tall and impossibly graceful, with skin like polished alabaster and striking geometric facial features. Her species was the backbone of the Federation's enforcement division, genetically conditioned to process probabilities and logic rather than messy organic emotions. She wore the immaculate slate-gray uniform of a High Inquisitor, and her eyes, the color of winter ice, locked onto Elias with absolute calculation. Elias lowered his hands just a fraction, projecting total relaxation. He greeted the Inquisitor with a casual nod, claiming he was merely conducting a history lesson on antique human plumbing. Kalen did not find him amusing. She stepped closer, her boots making no sound on the durasteel floor. She informed Elias that possession of an analog auditory generator carried a penalty of immediate disintegration. She recited his criminal record, a long list of smuggling infractions, unsanctioned atmospheric entries, and unauthorized trade of banned biological artifacts. The Synthetica merchant panicked. His logic processors overloaded at the sight of the Inquisitor. Instead of surrendering, the merchant lunged backward, activating a personal cloaking field and sprinting toward the cargo bay's ventilation exhaust. The enforcers instantly tracked the movement. Kalen barked an order to secure the perimeter. In the sudden chaotic shift of bodies, one of the heavily armored enforcers shoved past the shipping crate. Elias lunged to protect the velvet case, but the enforcer's armored shoulder caught his chest, sending him stumbling. The impact tipped the crate. The velvet case slid. Elias reached out, his fingers grazing the leather handle, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The saxophone tumbled from its plush bedding. It fell toward the grated durasteel floor. The heavy brass bell of the instrument struck the unyielding metal deck at a precise, terrible angle. It did not just clatter. The force of the impact drove a pocket of pressurized station air straight through the hollow body of the horn. The acoustic resonance of the ancient brass violently vibrating against the durasteel floor produced a pure, unadulterated, deafening note. A stark, jagged B-flat ripped through the cargo bay. To the Federation enforcers, the sound was an assault. Their auditory dampeners, designed only for the harsh shrieks of plasma fire or the low hum of machinery, failed to filter the organic warmth and profound depth of the acoustic wave. But the sound did not fade. It behaved in a way physics on Outpost 73 could not explain. The note amplified. It traveled through the deck plates, echoing down the ventilation shafts, carrying the raw mathematical perfection of a musical vibration into the very bones of the space station. Then, the floor dropped beneath their feet. A massive, violent tremor seized the entire outpost. Elias was thrown to his knees, bracing his hands against the rattling metal floor. Sparks showered from the overhead lighting arrays as the station's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. This was not a mechanical failure. Elias had been on enough dying ships to know the shudder of a failing reactor. This was external. This was a deep, cosmic vibration, a groan of immense physical weight shifting somewhere in the dark. Kalen fought to maintain her balance, her perfectly composed demeanor fracturing for a single second. She pulled a holographic data pad from her belt. The numbers cascading across the blue projection made her alabaster skin go terrifyingly pale. The station monitors were not tracking a structural breach. They were tracking a seismic event originating from the barren, uninhabited moon, orbiting 50,000 kilometers directly beneath them. The planetary sensors indicated that something beneath the dead crust of the moon had physically shifted, releasing a gravitational wave that directly correlated with the acoustic frequency still ringing faintly in the cargo bay. Elias stared at the fallen saxophone, then up at Kalen. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier, thick with an unspoken dread. Kalen holstered her data pad. Her face hardened back into a mask of pure aureal logic, but her hands moved with a newfound rigid urgency. She gestured sharply to her enforcers, ordering them to bind Elias Thorne and to place the metal object in a level 5 stasis field immediately. The enforcers roughly hauled Elias to his feet, slapping magnetic binders onto his wrists. Elias did not fight them. His eyes remained locked on the brass instrument as a shimmering blue energy field was erected over it. He had smuggled 100 instruments over the years, risking his life to preserve the echoes of a forgotten Earth. But as the enforcers dragged him toward the detention block, a chilling realization settled over him. The Federation did not ban music because it was distracting or culturally subversive. They banned it because it did something to the physical universe. The detention cell aboard the High Inquisitor's transport ship was designed to break the minds of hardened warlords. But Elias Thorne found the minimalist decor rather soothing. He just wished his magnetic restraints allowed him to scratch his nose. He sat in a stark, blindingly white room, his wrists securely bound to a metal chair by thick rings of blue energy. There were no visible doors, just seamless bulkheads and a single floating interrogation console. The air was scrubbed clean of any scent, filtered into a sterile blend of oxygen and nitrogen that tasted like absolute nothingness. For a man who lived his life surrounded by the rich smells of oiled brass, aged wood, and crowded spaceports, the sensory deprivation was mildly annoying. The seamless wall in front of him dissolved, revealing High Inquisitor Kaelin. She stepped into the cell with the lethal grace of a predatory bird, her slate-gray uniform immaculate, her datapad glowing faintly in her pale hands. The wall solidified behind her, trapping them in the brilliant white box. Kaelin did not speak immediately. She circled him, her ice-blue eyes analyzing his relaxed posture, his slowed heart rate, the slight smirk playing on his lips. Her aureal biology was processing his reactions, searching for the fear that every other prisoner projected. She found only amusement. She stopped in front of him, tapping the datapad. She demanded the coordinates of his supply lines, the names of his buyers, and the location of the manufacturing facilities still producing these dangerous acoustic weapons. Elias leaned back as far as the energy restraints allowed. He offered a warm, disarming smile, completely at odds with his situation. He explained that there were no manufacturing facilities left, only graveyards of culture. He told her she was chasing ghosts, hunting down fragments of a time when the universe was allowed to feel something other than cold perfection. He looked at her rigid posture, the way her shoulders held a permanent, tense symmetry. He noted that she moved like a metronome lacking a melody. He gently suggested that if she ever heard a properly tuned cello, her entire worldview would shatter into a million beautiful pieces. Kaelin narrowed her eyes. She asked him to define a cello. Elias knew his audience. He did not describe the rich, sorrowful weeping of the strings or the smell of the rosin. Instead, he described the instrument as a marvel of mathematical acoustics, a wooden amplifier designed to manipulate the physics of sound waves through a perfectly calculated resonant chamber. He described the precise tension of the strings, the geometry of the bridge, and the logarithmic perfection of the frequencies it produced. For a fraction of a second, the Inquisitor's icy demeanor thawed. Her logical mind latched onto the mathematical description, fascinated by the concept of an organic construct achieving such precise numerical harmony. A strange, unfamiliar spark ignited in her eyes as she leaned slightly closer to him, genuinely captivated by the physical mechanics of the forbidden object. The moment of quiet intimacy was violently shattered by a piercing alert from the floating console. Kaelin snapped back to her rigid posture, her face a mask of sudden irritation. She tapped the console, and the air between them shimmered, coalescing into the massive crimson-tinted hologram of Federation Counselor Varek. Varek was a towering figure of political power, his heavy, scarred face framed by the opulent, dark robes of the Inner Council. He governed 3 entire star sectors with an iron fist, renowned for his ruthless efficiency and his absolute devotion to the Federation's silent order. But today, the counselor did not look powerful. He looked terrified. He bypassed standard protocol, his voice tight and urgent, demanding an immediate situational report on the seismic anomaly registered at Outpost 73. Kaelin straightened, delivering a flawlessly detailed account of the sting operation. She explained the apprehension of the human smuggler, the seizure of the brass artifact, and the accidental impact that generated the B-flat acoustic wave. She relayed the planetary sensor data, confirming that the dead moon below the station had experienced a massive, localized tectonic shift at the exact moment the sound wave propagated through the outpost's hull. As she spoke, Elias watched the giant hologram of the counselor. Varek's skin flushed a deep, mottled purple. A bead of sweat formed on his brow, a physiological reaction that a being of his genetic modifications should not experience. His eyes darted rapidly, calculating a disaster that only he could see. Varek did not ask for the artifact to be brought to the capital for study. He did not ask for a thorough investigation of the moon. He slammed a heavy fist down on a desk outside the holographic projection, his voice trembling with a rage built entirely on fear. He ordered Kalen to incinerate the brass artifact in the ship's primary plasma exhaust immediately. Furthermore, he ordered the summary execution of the human smuggler. There was to be no trial, no official record of the arrest, and no further analysis of the seismic event. He commanded her to erase Elias Thorne from existence and jump back to the core worlds without delay. The hologram vanished, leaving the stark white cell feeling entirely too small. Elias swallowed hard, his charming smirk finally dropping. Summary execution without a trial was a severe violation of the Federation's foundational legal code. Kalen stood perfectly still. Her pale skin seemed to glow with a frantic internal energy. For an Oriole, logic and truth were not philosophical concepts. They were biological imperatives. Her species processed reality through a strict adherence to objective facts. She ran the variables through her mind, a dead moon experiencing a tectonic shift precisely synchronized with a localized acoustic vibration. A high-ranking Federation counselor displaying profound, uncalculated terror. An order to execute a prisoner without trial and destroy evidence of a physical anomaly. The math did not align. Varek had lied. The Federation's official stance was that analog instruments were banned because they induced chaotic social patterns. But Varek's visceral panic proved that the danger was not cultural. The danger was physical, hidden beneath the crust of the galaxy, and the highest levels of government were willing to murder anyone who stumbled upon it. Kalen stared at the blank wall where the hologram had been. If the Federation's ultimate authority was built on a foundational lie, then her entire life of service, every arrest she had made, and every law she had enforced was a mathematical falsehood. To obey an illogical command born of deception would break her own biological code. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed through the deck plating outside the cell. The execution squad. Federation enforcers did not waste time when a counselor gave a direct order. Elias pulled against the magnetic restraints, the blue energy burning his wrists. He told Kalen that whatever she was thinking, she needed to think faster. Kalen turned to him, her eyes completely devoid of the icy enforcement protocol he had seen earlier. They were wide, sharp, and burning with a terrifying clarity. She made a decision that would instantly render her the most hunted being in the galaxy. She stepped up to the floating console and rapidly punched in a sequence of bypass codes. The blue energy rings around Elias's wrists vanished. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the edge of the chair, rubbing his raw skin. He looked at the Inquisitor, completely stunned. Kalen did not offer a warm smile or a speech about rebellion. She unholstered a sleek silver plasma pistol and tossed it to him. She stated simply that she required his expertise in unauthorized evasion tactics. The heavy metal door of the cell began to slide open, revealing the armored shoulders of the execution squad. Elias caught the pistol, a familiar, dangerous grin spreading across his face. He told her she was making a terrible career choice, but he was honored to be her tour guide to the Galactic underground. Before the enforcers could raise their rifles, Kalen tapped a hidden switch on her belt. The lighting in the cell plunged into absolute darkness, instantly followed by the deafening shriek of the ship's emergency depressurization alarms. Red strobe lights flashed wildly in the corridor. In the chaos of the flashing lights and blaring sirens, Kaylin grabbed Elias's arm, pulling him toward a hidden maintenance hatch in the cell wall that her security clearance allowed her to access. They slipped into the cramped, grease-stained ventilation shaft just as plasma fire superheated the air where they had been standing seconds before. They scrambled through the narrow, dark corridors of the transport ship, the alarms ringing endlessly in their ears. Elias followed her lead, marveling at the ruthless efficiency of a high inquisitor applying her tactical genius to a prison break. She bypassed security doors, locked down bulkheads behind them, and incapacitated two heavily armed guards in the engineering bay with a brutal, calculated physical precision that left Elias thoroughly impressed and slightly terrified. They reached the primary command deck. Kaylin sealed the blast doors, locking out the remaining crew. She threw herself into the pilot's seat, her hands flying across the navigation console faster than Elias could track. She informed him that she was locking the warp drive coordinates to a blind jump, overriding the safety protocols that prevented travel without a confirmed destination. The Federation Armada would have this sector cordoned off within minutes. They needed to disappear into the chaotic currents of deep warp space before the local planetary defense grids locked onto their signature. Elias strapped himself into the co-pilot seat, watching the main view screen as the stars outside the ship began to stretch and blur. The ship's frame shuddered violently, protesting the massive influx of energy from the uncalibrated engines, as the blast doors behind them began to glow cherry red from the execution squad's breaching torches. Kaylin engaged the drive. The transport ship violently tore a hole in the fabric of space, ripping them away from Outpost 73, plunging them into a swirling tunnel of blinding violet light, and leaving the terrifying secrets of the slumbering moon far behind. Mars was no longer a monument to human expansion, but a rusted tomb hiding the loudest secret in the universe. Beneath its oxidized crust lay the only place left where a soul could still hear a string vibrate. The stolen Federation transport limped out of the chaotic slipstream of warp space, its sleek outer hull scorched black from unshielded dimensional friction. Elias Thorne bypassed the standard orbital approach, ignoring the automated warnings of the dead planet's defunct security grid. He drove the battered ship directly into the treacherous iron-rich depths of the Valles Marineris Canyon. Kaylin sat rigid in the co-pilot seat, her hands white-knuckled on the navigation console. Her aureal biology was rapidly calculating a 98% probability of fatal impact against the looming, rust-colored cliff face. Elias ignored her tense posture and the screaming proximity alarms, banking the ship violently to the left and flying straight into the solid canyon wall. The rock instantly dissolved into a shimmering holographic projection, revealing a massive cavernous tunnel illuminated by the warm amber glow of sodium lamps. They had entered Sanctuary, the subterranean heart of the human resistance. It was a sprawling, chaotic metropolis built deep into the hollowed-out lava tubes of the planet. Unlike the sterile, symmetrical perfection of Federation outposts, Sanctuary was a beautiful, desperate mess. It was a labyrinth of exposed copper wiring, salvaged fusion reactors, and repurposed starship hulls stacked haphazardly upon one another. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of ozone, roasted synthetic coffee, and the intense, unfiltered sweat of thousands of refugees living in close quarters. Kaylin stepped off the boarding ramp, her ice-blue eyes darting across the cavern. Her highly sensitive auditory receptors were immediately assaulted by the sheer, unregulated volume of human existence shouting, mechanical grinding, and the heavy thud of boots on metal grates. They were met by a contingent of heavily armed resistance fighters, led by a towering, battle-scarred veteran named Corin. The fighters instantly raised their magnetic pulse rifles at the sight of a High Inquisitor's pristine, slate-gray uniform. Elias stepped smoothly between Kaylin and the firing squad, raising his hands and employing every ounce of his roguish charm to de-escalate the standoff. He declared that the Inquisitor had just thrown away a millennium of genetic conditioning, alongside a very lucrative career, to save his life. He added that she possessed high-level clearance codes that could keep Sanctuary hidden from the Federation patrols currently sweeping the sector. Corrin reluctantly lowered his weapon, his eyes narrowed in deep suspicion. He gestured for them to follow, leading Elias and Kalen deep into the command center. A repurposed terraforming hub filled with flickering tactical displays and tangles of fiber optic cables. Here, amid the glow of ancient monitors, Elias and Kalen were finally handed the missing pieces of the Galactic puzzle. Corrin activated a massive holographic projector in the center of the circular room. The image of the Milky Way materialized in the air between them, but it was not mapped by stars, nebulae, or trade routes. Instead, the galaxy was mapped by massive, pulsing crimson signatures, each one buried incredibly deep within the core of a habitable planet, a barren moon, or a dense asteroid field. These were not geological anomalies or unstable planetary cores. They were biological. Corrin explained the dark, suppressed truth of the cosmos. The universe was inhabited by entities known in ancient texts as Leviathans. They were incomprehensibly vast, moon-sized biological organisms that existed eons before the Federation was formed. These creatures were not just animals. Their very biology shaped the physical laws of reality, generating gravitational fields and terraforming energy simply by existing. For thousands of years, they had been forced into a deep, comatose hibernation, buried beneath the crusts of countless worlds. Kalen stepped closer to the hologram, her logical mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the revelation. She demanded to know the correlation between slumbering cosmic giants and a banned brass instrument. The answer defied her rigid mathematical understanding of physics. Corrin brought up a secondary display, showing complex waveform charts overlapping with the crimson biological signatures. He explained that human music was a unique, highly dangerous anomaly in the universe. It was the only known phenomenon that perfectly blended rigorous mathematical structure, tempo, rhythm, and scale with raw, unpredictable emotional chaos. This highly specific acoustic cocktail precisely matched the biological resonance frequency of the slumbering Leviathans. Human music did not just move the soul. It physically moved the cosmos. It acted as a cosmic alarm clock for entities the size of gas giants. The Federation had not banned analog instruments to suppress a culture or to maintain social order. They had banned music because it was physics. The pure acoustic B-flat that Elias had accidentally played on Outpost 73 had not caused a random tectonic shift. It had caused the massive appendage of the creature buried beneath the moon to flinch in its sleep. The revelation hit Kalen with the force of a physical blow. The Federation, an empire built on the promise of absolute, unyielding order, was entirely terrified of an organic awakening they could not control. Their infinite energy grid, their political dominance, and their sterile laws were all constructed on top of a ticking biological time bomb. They had eradicated human art out of a desperate, cold-blooded need to keep the universe unconscious. Elias watched the structural foundation of Kalen's reality collapse in real time. The rigid tension in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a profound existential weight. He stepped toward her, gently taking her hand. The warmth of his skin contrasted sharply with her pale, cold fingers. Without a word to the resistance leaders, he guided her away from the crowded, noisy command center. He led her through a maze of narrow corridors until they reached a quiet, dimly lit archive room. The space was piled high to the ceiling with salvaged data drives, oxidized metal cases, and analog artifacts rescued from 100 different worlds. In the corner sat a bulky, ancient terminal connected to a pair of heavy, padded over-ear headphones. Elias picked up the headphones, wiping a thin layer of red Martian dust from the worn leather. He turned to Kaylin and gently brushed a stray lock of alabaster hair away from her face. He told her in a soft, quiet voice that knowing the math behind the universe was entirely different from actually feeling it. He carefully placed the padded cups over her ears, ensuring they sealed out the ambient hum of the cavern, and reached down to activate the terminal. He did not choose a loud, chaotic rock anthem or a fast-paced jazz improvisation. He selected a centuries-old cello suite, a slow, mournful, and profoundly beautiful progression of deep acoustic chords. As the resonant vibrations traveled through the analog wires and into her auditory canals, Kaylin gasped. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. The music bypassed her logic centers entirely, flooding her highly sensitive nervous system with pure, unfiltered frequency. It was a language of feeling, mathematically perfect yet achingly, tragically human. She felt a phantom weight press into her chest, an overwhelming, terrifying rush of sorrow, joy, and profound connection that she had no biological context to process. For the first time in her life, the rigid, reinforced walls of her aureal conditioning completely shattered. The music rewired her synapses, replacing cold calculation with raw, breathtaking emotion. A single, unbidden tear traced a slow path down her pale cheek, catching the dim light of the archive room. She looked up at Elias, pulling the headphones down to rest around her neck. Her ice-blue eyes were no longer cold and calculating. They were wide, luminous, and incredibly vulnerable. The sheer emotional overload of the experience drew her magnetically toward him, instantly erasing the massive, culturally enforced boundaries between a hardened outlaw and a high-ranking inquisitor. Elias leaned in, his gaze fixed on hers, the air between them thick with an entirely new kind of tension. The universe and its massive, slumbering secrets faded away, leaving only the quiet space between them. The fragile, beautiful moment was violently erased by a catastrophic shockwave. The heavy rock ceiling of the archive room cracked with a deafening groan, raining red dust and jagged debris down upon them. The ancient terminal sparked brilliantly and died, instantly cutting off the warmth of the cello suite. The amber sodium lamps flickered wildly and blew out, plunging the subterranean base into the harsh, strobing red glare of emergency combat lighting. Deafening proximity sirens began to shriek through every corridor of sanctuary. Elias grabbed Kaylin tightly by the waist, pulling her forcefully under the reinforced archway of a heavy steel blast door just as a massive chunk of the cavern roof collapsed where they had been standing seconds before. The ground bucked furiously beneath their boots. Through the thick rock above, they could hear the terrifying rhythmic thud of localized atmospheric detonations. The Federation had not lost them in the blind warp jump. Somehow, against all known laws of spatial navigation, Counselor Varric had tracked their exact trajectory. The heavy dreadnoughts had arrived, and the relentless orbital bombardment of Mars had already begun. A planet designed to be an eternal tomb was rapidly transforming into an extraordinarily bright crematorium. Mars was physically cracking open under the weight of 1,000 orbital plasma cannons, and the Federation was enthusiastically swinging the hammer. Sanctuary was disintegrating. The massive lava tubes that had protected the human resistance for decades were collapsing, raining jagged chunks of oxidized iron onto the makeshift city below. Emergency klaxons blared in a deafening, overlapping chorus, entirely drowning out the screams of the evacuating refugees. Elias and Kaylin sprinted through the crumbling corridors, dodging sparking conduits and the frantic rush of people fleeing toward the deep-crust emergency shelters. Corin, his face smeared with ash and blood, intercepted them at the entrance to the primary hangar bay. He shoved a heavy lead-lined metallic cylinder into Elias's hands. The object was shockingly dense, covered in physical analog combination dials and thermal shielding. Corin grabbed Elias by the shoulder, his grip like a vice, and explained that this was the Genesis drive. It was the sole remaining complete archive of humanity's musical history. It held every symphony, every jazz improvisation, every folk song, and every rebellious rock anthem ever recorded before the Federation plunged the galaxy into silence. Corin ordered them to take it and run. He turned back to the collapsing city, raising his magnetic pulse rifle to buy them exactly 30 seconds of cover fire against the Federation drop pods that were already breaching the upper ceiling. Elias did not waste time arguing. He grabbed Kaylin's hand and hauled her toward the center of the hangar, where a single sleek vessel sat untouched amid the chaos. It was a prototype blockade runner, a wedge of radar-absorbent black composite armor built strictly for speed and evasion, entirely lacking in standard safety features or comfort. They scrambled up the boarding ramp just as a Federation plasma torpedo breached the hangar roof, instantly vaporizing a row of salvaged cargo haulers. The concussive wave threw them violently into the ship's narrow airlock. Elias slammed his fist into the emergency seal override, the heavy door locking into place and instantly cutting off the apocalyptic roar of the dying Martian base. Kaylin vaulted into the pilot's seat. The raw, unfiltered emotions awakened by the cello suite were still coursing through her alien biology. But instead of paralyzing her, the adrenaline fused perfectly with her Oriel tactical precision. Her pale hands flew across the uncalibrated control yokes. She did not bother with pre-flight checks or atmospheric warming protocols. She ignited the primary thrusters at maximum yield, blowing the hangar doors off their hinges with the sheer concussive force of the ship's wake. The black wedge shot out of the Valles Marineris canyon like a bullet exiting a barrel. The Martian sky was a nightmare of intersecting laser fire and falling debris. High above the atmosphere, 3 massive Federation dreadnoughts formed a triangular net of destruction, their underbellies glowing white-hot as they rained continuous fire upon the planet. Kaylin gripped the controls, her eyes wide and burning with a terrifying new intensity. She threw the blockade runner into a vertical climb, aggressively weaving through the descending barrage of plasma artillery. Elias strapped himself into the co-pilot seat, his knuckles white as he monitored the deflector shields rapidly draining to critical levels. He watched Kaylin fly, marveling at the way she predicted the dreadnoughts' targeting algorithms and danced the fragile ship through the microscopic gaps in their firing solutions. They breached the exosphere just as the dreadnoughts managed a synchronized lock. Proximity alarms screamed through the small cockpit. Kaylin did not flinch. She slammed the warp drive engagement lever forward, relying on the ship's prototype engine to tear a ragged hole in the fabric of space. The blockade runner violently punched its way into the slipstream, leaving the heavily armed Federation armada firing at empty vacuum. The immediate silence inside the cockpit was heavy and exhausted. The swirling violet hues of deep warp space reflected off the forward canopy, casting a bruised light across their faces. Elias unbuckled his harness, his chest heaving as he stared at the heavy cylinder of the Genesis drive secured to the deck plates. They had survived, but they were now carrying the most dangerous contraband in the known universe, and the entire galactic military was hunting them. Kaylin remained in the pilot's seat, her breathing shallow. She reached up to her collar and violently ripped the High Inquisitor insignia from her uniform, a metallic starburst that clattered uselessly onto the floor. She stared at it, a symbol of a life entirely built on a lie. She needed to understand the depth of that lie. She swiveled her chair toward the ship's primary tactical computer and produced her personal data spike. It was a highly illegal, heavily encrypted slicing tool she had confiscated from a cyber terrorist years ago and kept for her own covert investigations. She jammed the spike into the console, bypassing the blockade runner's security protocols and establishing a heavily masked, one-way shadow connection to the Federation's secure data networks. Elias leaned over her shoulder, watching lines of encrypted code cascade across the monitors. He asked her what she was looking for. He assumed she was trying to figure out how Counselor Varric had tracked them so quickly to Mars. Kaylin shook her head, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the scrolling data. She explained that Varric's ability to track them was a symptom of a much larger disease. She was digging directly into the Counselor's personal restricted archives, using backdoor clearance codes that only a handful of beings in the galaxy possessed. She needed to know why the governing council of 1,000 star systems was paralyzed by the thought of a slumbering biological entity. The scrolling code suddenly halted. The monitor flickered, rendering a massive, highly detailed holographic schematic in the center of the cramped cockpit. It was a blueprint of planetary engineering, but it was horrifying. The hologram displayed a cross-section of a habitable planet. Buried deep within the mantle, wrapped around the molten core, was the curled, majestic form of a Leviathan. But the creature was not resting peacefully. Driven deep into its spine, piercing its colossal biological armor, were thousands of massive metallic structures. They looked like jagged metallic teeth, plunging from the planet's surface straight into the creature's nervous system. Kaylin translated the high-level engineering readouts, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute disgust and rising anger. The Federation did not possess an infinite energy grid. They possessed a parasitic feeding tube. The blueprints detailed the true foundation of the galactic economy. The Leviathans, by their very nature, generated boundless, cosmic energy as they slept. Their slow heartbeats produced immense geothermal and electromagnetic power, capable of sustaining life on the planets above them. The Federation had discovered these dormant gods centuries ago, instead of protecting them or communicating with them. The founders of the government had constructed monolithic siphons needles the size of skyscrapers to drain the creature's life force continuously. This stolen energy was what powered the pristine Federation capitals, the sprawling military armadas, and the luxurious climate-controlled outposts. The absolute unyielding order of the galaxy was heavily subsidized by the torture of captive cosmic giants. Elias stared at the horrific mechanical spikes driven into the graceful glowing lines of the Leviathan's hologram. The humor drained entirely from his face. He possessed a smuggler's flexible morality, but he recognized pure evil when he saw it. The Federation was not a utopia. It was a vampire masquerading as a saint. Kaylin pieced together the final fragments of the data stream. She explained the true terror driving Counselor Varric. If human music awakened the Leviathans, the creatures would physically shift, fracturing the planetary crusts and shattering the massive siphons embedded in their spines. The moment the Leviathans woke up, the Federation's infinite energy grid would completely collapse. Varric and his council would instantly lose their monopoly on power, their military advantage, and their iron grip on billions of citizens. They were murdering artists and burning instruments simply to keep their battery supply anesthetized. The profound immorality of the revelation severed the last remaining threads of Kaylin's loyalty to her former life. She realized that enforcing the law meant enforcing the sedation of enslaved gods. Elias picked up the heavy cylinder of the Genesis drive, feeling the weight of the history locked inside. He looked at Kaylin, seeing the cold calculation of an inquisitor replaced entirely by the righteous fury of someone who had just discovered the beauty of a cello, only to learn the universe was being strangled to keep it quiet. He offered a grim, determined smile. He told her that running was no longer a viable career path for either of them. They had a fast ship. They had the entire catalog of human emotion locked in a lead cylinder, and they had a galaxy full of sleeping giants waiting for a morning call. Kaylin met his gaze, the tactical brilliance returning to her eyes, now fueled by a burning, undeniable passion. She agreed. They needed to find the prime node of the siphon network. They needed to find the oldest, largest Leviathan in the cosmos, a creature whose awakening would cause a chain reaction the Federation could not possibly contain. She turned back to the navigation console, her fingers flying across the keys as she plotted a desperate course into the darkest, most uncharted territories of the Outer Rim. The question hanging heavily in the quiet cockpit was no longer how to survive, but what the universe would look like when the parasite finally lost its host. There is a place on the edge of the galactic map where even the Federation's light cannot reach. A graveyard of crushed stars known as the Abyssal Shallows. To fly a ship into its churning dark matter was considered an incredibly creative form of suicide. But survival was no longer the primary objective for Elias and Kalen. They were hunting for the foundation of the universe. Kalen's stolen data spike had revealed the location of a being designated in the hidden archives only as the Prime Chord. It was the oldest, most impossibly massive Leviathan in existence, slumbering at the exact center of the Abyssal Shallows. The Federation had never dared to attach a siphon to it, fearing its immense volatile energy signature. If they could reach this ancient giant and broadcast the Genesis drive, its awakening would not just shake a single moon. Its bioacoustic resonance would act as a master frequency, rippling through the subspace network and shattering every parasitic energy siphon across 1,000 worlds. The journey required navigating a realm where the laws of physics were completely broken. The blockade runner plunged into the dark matter nebula, immediately encountering treacherous gravity wells that threatened to crush the small ship like an aluminum can. Invisible sinkholes of dense mass pulled at the hull, while rivers of violent magenta radiation lashed against the reinforced viewports. Surviving the maelstrom required a flawless, terrifying synchronization between the two fugitives. Elias took manual control of the flight yoke, relying entirely on his raw, unfiltered smuggler's instinct to feel the subtle shifts in the ship's momentum. Kalen sat rigidly at the tactical station, her aureal mind processing the chaotic telemetry data faster than the ship's failing computer. She called out course corrections in fractions of a degree, predicting the microscopic folds in space-time just seconds before they materialized. Elias executed her commands without a single second of hesitation. He trusted her mathematical brilliance with his life, and she trusted his chaotic human reflexes to keep them entirely intact. When they finally broke through the worst of the turbulence, slipping into a temporary pocket of calm vacuum deep within the nebula, the adrenaline slowly ebbed from the cockpit. The glowing, bruised light of the dark matter cast long shadows across their exhausted faces. In the quiet hum of the idling engines, the immense weight of their mission settled over them. Elias unbuckled his harness and leaned back, his eyes fixed on the swirling cosmic storm outside. He spoke softly about a dusty, forgotten fringe world where he had grown up, a place where the air was always choked with ash. He told her about finding a cracked wooden acoustic guitar buried in a scrap heap when he was a boy. It had only 2 strings left, but the first time he plucked them, the vibration resonated in his chest, and he knew instantly that the universe was fundamentally meant to be loud. He had spent his entire life chasing that feeling, fighting against a government that wanted to sanitize the human soul. Kalen listened, the cold logic of her upbringing completely overshadowed by the profound warmth of his memory. She looked at her pale hands, confessing her own deepest fear. For her entire existence, she had been a biological calculator, a living weapon bred to enforce the silent will of a parasitic empire. She told Elias that before she heard the cello in the Martian archives, her life had been a terrifying expanse of emotional emptiness. The Federation had not just stolen energy from the Leviathans, they had stolen the capacity to feel from their own citizens. The shared vulnerability bridged the final gap between them. Elias reached out, his calloused fingers gently wrapping around her hand. Kalen did not pull away. The contrast of his rough, chaotic warmth against her cool, precise demeanor felt perfectly balanced. In the shadow of a dying nebula, surrounded by the absolute worst the galaxy had to offer, they found a profound, unspoken anchor in one another. But Kaylin's mind, newly awakened to emotion, could not completely let go of the data she had analyzed. She looked at the Genesis drive resting on the deck plates and mentioned a deeply unsettling anomaly in the Prime Chord's neural readouts. The creature was ancient and dormant, but its brainwaves were not entirely flat. It possessed a cyclical rhythmic spike that suggested it was not merely sleeping, it was actively listening. The realization hung heavily in the air. If the creature was already waiting for a signal, what would happen to the physical fabric of the sector when it finally heard the unfiltered chaos of a human symphony? They did not have time to debate the cosmic consequences. Elias went to work on the most dangerous mechanical modification of his life. The blockade runner was a stealth ship, entirely lacking the massive communication arrays needed to broadcast a signal through dense dark matter. To wake the Prime Chord, Elias had to turn the ship itself into a giant omnidirectional amplifier. He stripped the interior paneling, pulling thick bundles of fiber optic cabling from the life support systems and splicing them directly into the heavy lead cylinder of the Genesis drive. His plan was brilliantly reckless. He intended to route the digital audio files from the human archive directly into the ship's deflector shield emitters. By modulating the energy frequency of the shields to match the acoustic waves of the music, the ship would project a massive physical vibration of pure sound out into the vacuum of the nebula. However, the modification required bypassing the fusion core's primary thermal limiters. Pushing that much raw data through the shield grid would cause the engines to run dangerously hot. Elias wiped a streak of grease from his forehead, securing the final connection. He knew the absolute truth of his engineering. Initiating the broadcast would instantly drop their physical defenses to zero, and the resulting energy feedback might entirely melt the ship from the inside out before the song even finished playing. Kaylin monitored the sensor sweeps. Her eyes locked on the swirling vortex of midnight blue and crushed starlight directly ahead. The coordinates indicated they had reached the exact center of the abyssal shallows. The dark matter here was incredibly thick, behaving almost like a liquid ocean of cosmic energy. Somewhere deep beneath the swirling clouds, the Prime Chord waited. Elias strapped himself back into the pilot's seat, his hand hovering over the jury-rigged broadcast switch. He looked at Kaylin, offering one last, defiant smirk, ready to unleash the loudest noise the galaxy had heard in a millennium, before his fingers could press the heavy metal toggle. The blockade runner's proximity alarm shrieked with a deafening, terrifying intensity. The tactical monitors instantly flared brilliant crimson. The fabric of space directly in front of them violently tore open. It was not a spatial anomaly or a gravitational sinkhole. It was a massive, synchronized warp breach. A dozen gargantuan Federation dreadnoughts ripped out of the slipstream, their jagged obsidian hulls cutting through the dark matter like butcher knives. They were not standard patrol vessels. These were the elite, heavily armored capital ships of Counselor Varek's personal guard, bristling with high-yield plasma artillery and gravitational tether cannons. Varek had not lost their trail. He had anticipated their target and laid a trap at the end of the universe. The dreadnoughts immediately deployed a spherical net of solid energy, completely boxing the tiny blockade runner in from all sides. The targeting lasers of 1,000 weapon batteries converged on their fragile cockpit, painting the interior in a harsh, deadly red light. They were trapped in the dead center of a heavily armed kill zone, with their deflector shields currently wired to play music instead of blocking plasma fire. The targeting lasers painted the tiny cockpit in a suffocating web of lethal red light, promising instant vaporization for the galaxy's most wanted outlaws. Instead of immediate plasma fire, The primary communication console bypassed every encrypted firewall on the blockade runner to project the towering, furious hologram of Counselor Varek directly into the cramped space. He did not look like a composed political leader holding all the cards. His heavy robes were slightly disheveled, and the deep scars on his face stood out starkly against his flushed purple skin. He commanded an armada capable of reducing entire star systems to ash. Yet he was radiating absolute, undeniable panic. He understood exactly what the heavily modified deflector shields on the tiny ship were designed to do. And he knew what slept beneath the swirling dark matter outside. Varek ignored Elias entirely, locking his piercing gaze onto Kaylin. He invoked her species, her training, and the foundational logic of the Aureal biology. He offered her a magnificent, impossible deal. He promised a full, unconditional pardon, the immediate restoration of her rank as High Inquisitor, and a permanent seat within the inner echelon of the Galactic government. All she had to do was raise her weapon, execute the human smuggler sitting beside her, and eject the lead cylinder containing the Genesis drive into the vacuum of space. He attempted to justify the galactic atrocity. Varek argued that the Leviathans were not divine beings, but mindless, dangerous batteries. He claimed the siphons were a necessary burden to maintain 1,000 years of unbroken peace, keeping billions of citizens safe, fed, and entirely free from the chaotic ravages of universal entropy. To wake the prime chord was not liberation. It was the mathematical certainty of total galactic collapse. Elias did not reach for his own weapon. He sat perfectly still in the pilot's seat, his hands resting lightly on the flight yoke. He did not beg or try to sway her. He simply looked at Kaylin, his eyes holding a quiet, unwavering trust. He had seen the rigid enforcer die in the Martian archives, replaced by a woman who understood the profound, messy beauty of a universe allowed to feel. Kaylin stood up, her face a mask of serene, terrifying clarity. She looked at the holographic projection of the most powerful man in the galaxy. She calmly explained that a civilization powered by the continuous torture of an unconscious captive was not a peaceful order, but a parasitic infection. She told Varek that her biological imperative was indeed to seek the ultimate truth, and the absolute truth of the universe was that it was meant to be a symphony, not a graveyard. She unholstered her sleek, silver plasma pistol with a fluid, practiced grace. She did not aim it at Elias. She leveled the weapon directly at the ship's communication array and pulled the trigger. A blinding flash of superheated energy instantly vaporized the holographic projector, severing the connection and plunging the cockpit back into the dim, bruised light of the dark matter nebula. The immediate consequence of her defiance was catastrophic. Outside the viewport, the 12 heavily armored Federation dreadnoughts unleashed hell. A barrage of high-yield plasma torpedoes painted the vacuum with streaks of blinding white death. Elias threw the flight yoke hard to the left, banking the blockade runner into a violent, stomach-churning spin. The tiny ship danced through the initial volley, but they were entirely outmatched. A glancing blow from a proximity detonation caught their starboard thruster. The kinetic shockwave hurled them against their harnesses, throwing a shower of golden sparks across the cockpit as the structural integrity alarms began to scream. They were losing armor plating by the second, and their weapons were completely useless against the dreadnought's heavy shielding. They had one single, apocalyptic option left. Elias reached across the heavily modified console and slammed his fist down on the jury-rigged broadcast toggle. The Genesis drive engaged. Deep within the belly of the ship, the experimental fusion core howled, redirecting its entire output away from the engines and thrusting it violently into the deflector shield grid. The interior of the cockpit grew immediately, suffocatingly hot as the thermal limiters bypassed. The ship did not broadcast a radio frequency. It broadcast physical kinetic energy. The deflector shields ignited, turning the blockade runner into a colossal glowing tuning fork vibrating with the combined weight of humanity's entire musical heritage. Elias had not selected a single song. He had set the drive to output a chaotic, overlapping collision of mankind's greatest artistic achievements. The soaring, mathematically perfect architecture of a classical Beethoven symphony crashed violently into the raw, unpredictable, and fiercely emotional improvisation of a heavy brass jazz ensemble. It was a beautiful, devastating contradiction of structure and chaos, logic and soul. In the vacuum of space, there is no air to carry sound. But the abyssal shallows were not empty. The dense, liquid-like dark matter of the nebula absorbed the kinetic vibrations of the ship's shields. The effect was instantaneous and visually staggering. The invisible waves of acoustic energy struck the dark matter, causing the subatomic particles to violently rub against one another. The midnight blue nebula suddenly ignited. Massive, rippling shock waves of bioluminescent gold, violet, and electric blue fractured the darkness, painting the cosmos with the visual manifestation of a chaotic jazz symphony. The space around them was literally dancing. The Federation armada ceased firing, their targeting sensors completely blinded by the sudden, overwhelming eruption of bioluminescent energy and shifting gravitational localized anomalies. Then, the universe beneath them began to rise. The sensors on the blockade runner entirely flatlined, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the mass moving up from the depths of the nebula. A shadow larger than a standard gas giant eclipsed the glowing clouds of dark matter. The prime cord breached the surface of the cosmic ocean. It was a creature of incomprehensible majesty and terrifying scale. Its physical form defied standard biology, composed of shifting tectonic plates of luminescent, organic armor that resembled the spiraling geometric perfection of a nautilus shell, stretched to the size of a planet. Great, sweeping tendrils of pure electromagnetic energy trailed behind it, catching the light of the vibrating dark matter like strings on a cosmic instrument. The sheer physical displacement of its movement generated a localized gravitational tsunami. A massive, invisible tidal wave of kinetic force ripped outward from the creature's emergence. The elite dreadnoughts of Varek's armada, ships designed to withstand the crushing pressure of black holes, were caught entirely off guard. The gravitational wave hit them with the force of a solid wall. The massive capital ships were violently thrown off their axis, their strict symmetrical formations instantly shattered. Massive hull plates groaned and buckled under the shifting physics of the sector. Two of the dreadnoughts collided in the chaos, their deflector shields flaring brilliantly before failing entirely, sending them spiraling uncontrollably into the outer edges of the nebula. Inside the tiny blockade runner, the situation was equally desperate. The ship was caught in the terrifying backwash of the Leviathan's wake, violently shaking as the hull temperature reached critical mass. Elias fought the controls with everything he had, his muscles burning as he tried to keep the nose of the ship pointed away from the crushing gravity of the massive creature. Kalen frantically rerouted failing power cells, trying to keep the life support systems online as the ship threatened to melt around them. They had successfully delivered the alarm clock to the oldest god in the cosmos. The dark matter was glowing with the brilliant, undeniable rhythm of human defiance, and Varek's elite trap was rapidly disintegrating into a chaotic struggle for survival. But as the prime cord fully emerged, its massive armored plates shifting and glowing with an internal rising heat, the creature remained silent. It hung in the center of the shattered nebula, dwarfing the scattered Federation fleet and the smoking, dying blockade runner. The creature was fully awake, absorbing the raw, chaotic emotion of the Genesis broadcast, its colossal mind processing the first song it had heard in a million years. Elias and Kalen watched through the reinforced viewport, the heat in the cockpit rising to agonizing levels. completely paralyzed by the awe of the entity before them. The Leviathan had broken the Federation's grip on the sector, but its immense glowing presence posed a far more terrifying question. The galaxy had kept these creatures sedated for a reason, and a waking god was entirely unbound by the petty moralities of the mortals who had disturbed its slumber. A cornered tyrant with a fleet of warships will always choose destruction over understanding, even when faced with a living god. Aboard the command deck of his flagship, Counselor Varric watched the awe-inspiring emergence of the Prime Chord not with reverence, but with a primal, consuming terror. The creature was the physical embodiment of his absolute failure. He clawed his way back to his command chair as the localized gravity stabilized, ignoring the chaotic alarms and the terrified shouts of his bridge crew. He slammed his fist onto the fleet-wide communication channel, his voice cracking with sheer, desperate rage. He ordered every remaining dreadnought to form a firing line and unleash their entire arsenal directly into the center of the Leviathan's mass. The elite captains of the Federation Armada were conditioned to obey without question. 9 massive obsidian warships managed to right themselves in the swirling dark matter. They locked their targeting computers onto the glowing mountainous tectonic plates of the cosmic giant. In perfect, ruthless unison, they fired. Thousands of high-yield plasma torpedoes, antimatter warheads, and heavy laser batteries ignited the vacuum. The barrage was entirely catastrophic, carrying enough concentrated destructive force to crack a terrestrial planet cleanly in half. The blinding wave of munitions streaked across the abyssal shallows, directly impacting the spiraling, bioluminescent shell of the Prime Chord. Elias and Kalen braced for an apocalyptic shockwave, shielding their eyes from the agonizing glare of the combined detonations. The shockwave never came. As the blinding white light of the plasma fire faded, the true nature of the Leviathan's biology was revealed. The creature did not possess a standard energy deflector shield. Its organic armor was designed to consume raw universal entropy. The catastrophic kinetic and thermal energy of the Federation's bombardment did not leave a single scorch mark. Instead, the jagged, nautilus-like plates of the Prime Chord absorbed the massive influx of destructive power, drinking it in like dry earth absorbing a sudden downpour. The bioluminescent veins running through its massive form flared from a soft violet to a blinding, furious gold. The creature had not been damaged. It had been fed. Varric stared at his primary tactical monitor, his purple skin draining of all color. The energy readings of the Leviathan were completely off the scale, climbing exponentially. The Prime Chord did not lash out in anger. It did not possess the petty, vindictive rage of the mortals who had tried to murder it. Instead, the massive entity shifted its colossal bulk, its glowing electromagnetic tendrils sweeping gracefully through the energized dark matter. It processed the chaotic, beautiful human music still radiating from the dying shields of Elias's blockade runner, and it finally offered a response. The Leviathan sang. It was not a sound that could be captured by a microphone or played through a speaker. It was a primordial, profound kinetic vibration, a single, deep, resonant harmonic frequency that bypassed auditory receptors and traveled directly into the molecular foundation of the universe. Inside the tiny, sweltering cockpit of the blockade runner, Elias and Kalen felt the note in their very bones. It was a heavy, thrumming bass chord that perfectly harmonized with the soaring strings and frantic brass still playing from the Genesis drive. It did not hurt. It was incredibly warm, entirely overwhelming and profoundly comforting. It felt like the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of the cosmos itself, reminding them that they were not alone in the dark. But to the rigid, parasitic machinery of the Federation, that perfect harmonic note was a death sentence. The Prime Chord's song did not stay confined to the abyssal shallows. The dark matter nebula acted as a massive acoustic amplifier, catching the physical vibration and projecting it outward. The frequency rode the heavily utilized subspace communication channels that the Federation used to maintain their infinite energy grid. The song traveled at a speed entirely unbound by the laws of standard relativity, washing over 1,000 star systems in a matter of seconds. Kaylin watched her fractured tactical monitor with breathless fascination as the data streams reported a galaxy-wide cascade. The monolithic metal siphons driven deep into the spines of the slumbering Leviathans across the cosmos were built to withstand immense pressure and intense heat. They were not built to withstand their own exact resonant frequency. The deep singing vibration of the prime chord struck the metallic parasitic needles. They began to vibrate, violently shuddering within the planetary mantles. The structural integrity of the alien alloy suffered immediate, catastrophic molecular stress. Across the galaxy, from the shining spires of the capital world to the brutal mining outposts of the outer rim, the siphons shattered. Millions of tons of oppressive machinery instantly dissolved into harmless metallic dust. The infinite energy grid died in a single heartbeat. The immediate consequence in the abyssal shallows was absolute. The massive Federation dreadnoughts surrounding the prime chord went entirely dark. Their heavily armored deflector shields evaporated. Their primary fusion engines choked and died. The harsh, artificial gravity plating failed instantly, sending the heavily armed enforcers floating helplessly toward the ceilings of their pristine corridors. The majestic, terrifying armada of Counselor Varric was reduced to a collection of silent, drifting metal tombs in the span of 3 seconds. Aboard the flagship, Varric floated untethered above his command chair. The red emergency lights flickered once and died. The absolute silence he had spent his entire life enforcing had finally arrived. But it was not the silence of absolute order. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of his own irrelevance. His political empire, his military dominance, and his infinite power had been completely dismantled by a single note of music. He was stranded in the dark, a king ruling over nothing but a dead console. But the prime chord was not finished. The energy it had absorbed from the dreadnought's bombardment, combined with the awakening of its own immense internal power, needed to be released. The Leviathan exhaled. A wave of pure, shimmering, terraforming light washed outward from the creature, cutting through the dense clouds of the nebula. Elias and Kaylin watched, completely paralyzed by awe, as the waves struck the barren, jagged asteroids floating at the edge of the shallows. The dead rock did not shatter. It bloomed. Microscopic traces of frozen moisture instantly thawed and pooled into crystal-clear lakes. Rapid growth, luminescent flora erupted from the oxidized dust, painting the barren surfaces in vibrant shades of emerald and sapphire. The localized gravitational field of the Leviathan pulled a thin, breathable atmosphere around the newly birthed microplanets. The hidden truth of the universe was finally laid bare before them. The Leviathans were not dangerous batteries, and they were not mindless beasts. They were the original architects of life. They were cosmic gardeners, swimming through the void of space, breathing atmosphere and vitality into dead rock. The Federation had suppressed the very mechanism of creation to power their air conditioners and plasma rifles. Elias reached over and slowly deactivated the jury-rigged broadcast switch. The blockade runner's fusion core, entirely pushed past its breaking point, gave a final, exhausted shudder before plunging their own ship into darkness. The Genesis drive went silent. They were drifting, entirely devoid of power, floating in the warm, glowing wake of a newly awakened god. Kaylin unbuckled her harness, letting herself float in the sudden zero gravity of the cockpit. She drifted toward Elias, her alabaster skin illuminated by the vibrant, blooming asteroids outside the viewport. The strict mathematical enforcer was completely gone. In her place was a woman who had just witnessed the absolute beauty of a chaotic, living universe. Elias caught her hand, anchoring her in the weightless cabin. He looked out at the drifting, powerless Federation dreadnoughts and the incredibly vast, majestic form of the Prime Chord as it slowly began to swim out of the nebula, its journey back into the wider galaxy just beginning. The Federation was broken. 1,000 star systems were suddenly plunged into the Dark Ages, entirely stripped of their stolen power. Elias knew that the galaxy was about to descend into a period of massive, unpredictable chaos. Governments would fall, planets would scramble for resources, and the waking of the other Leviathans would reshape the very physical maps of the cosmos. No one knew what melodies the other slumbering giants would choose to sing when they finally opened their eyes. But as Elias looked at Kaylin, seeing the reflection of the blooming stars in her ice-blue eyes, he smiled. The universe was going to be messy, loud, and entirely unpredictable. It was finally exactly the way it was always supposed to be. The galaxy did not collapse into a sea of blood and fire when the infinite energy grid died, but it simply learned how to breathe in the dark. The immediate transition was undeniably brutal for the political elite who had built their empires on the stolen warmth of slumbering gods. Counselor Varek and his heavily armed inner circle, stranded inside their drifting, powerless dreadnoughts in the abyssal shallows, were eventually recovered weeks later by a humble fleet of agricultural haulers. The galaxy's most ruthless tyrant ended his imposing career not in a blaze of glorious combat, but by trading his heavily embroidered ceremonial robes for a thermal blanket and a bowl of synthetic protein paste. The absolute authority of the Federation evaporated the exact moment their parasitic metallic siphons crumbled to dust within the planetary mantles. Without the endless stolen energy of the Leviathans, their terrifying plasma rifles were just expensive metal clubs, and their strict, unyielding laws were nothing more than empty suggestions broadcast to completely dead terminals. Across 1,000 star systems, the physical fabric of reality shifted as the other cosmic giants slowly opened their ancient eyes. They did not wake in a destructive, vengeful frenzy. They simply stretched. Their massive bioluminescent forms rose from the dusty crusts of dead moons and barren asteroids, exhaling thick, oxygen-rich atmospheres directly into the freezing void. The cosmos was no longer a silent, sterile machine governed by cold mathematics. It transformed into a massive, vibrating, and intensely loud ecosystem. Spatial navigation completely changed overnight. Pilots no longer relied on rigid digital beacons. They learned to navigate the treacherous warp currents by mapping the deep, resonant acoustic songs generated by the moving Leviathans. Earth, previously classified by the governing council as a Class A biological hazard and heavily quarantined as a toxic tomb, was completely unrecognizable 3 years later. The planetary skies, once permanently choked with the gray, suffocating ash of relentless orbital bombardment, were a brilliant, piercing blue. The dormant seeds buried deep within the oxidized soil had been coaxed into violent, beautiful bloom by the distant, echoing master frequency of the Prime Chord. Dense, vibrant emerald forests reclaimed the rusted, towering skeletons of ancient human cities. The oceans, previously frozen and stagnant, churned with heavy rhythmic tides driven by the gravitational pull of the newly awakened universe. Elias Thorne stood on the edge of a newly formed coastal cliff, the sharp, salty sea breeze tugging roughly at his worn leather jacket. He looked older, but the chaotic, hunted stress of constantly outrunning Federation enforcers was completely replaced by the quiet, grounded satisfaction of a man who had finally found a permanent gravity well. Beside him stood Kaylin. She no longer wore the immaculate slate-gray uniform of a high inquisitor. She wore simple, brightly dyed woven fabrics traded from the independent merchants of the Outer Rim. Her alabaster skin, previously shielded from all unfiltered radiation, was now kissed by the actual chaotic warmth of a yellow sun. The rigid mathematical tension that had defined her entire biological existence was completely gone. She moved with a relaxed, fluid grace, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the vibrant, messy life of the world around them. The adjustment for her people, the logic-driven Oriole species, had been the most severe in the galaxy. Stripped of the Federation's absolute order, their entire society had experienced a collective, terrifying emotional awakening. Kaylin had spent the last 3 years broadcasting messages back to her homeworld, acting as a crucial guide for a species desperately trying to understand how to process grief, joy, and the overwhelming, terrifying beauty of unpredictable art. She leaned comfortably against Elias, resting her head on his shoulder as they watched the horizon. The atmosphere above the crashing ocean was incredibly busy. Sleek, colorful atmospheric shuttles and patched-together asymmetrical cargo haulers descended rapidly through the white clouds. They were not carrying plasma torpedoes, and they were not enforcing silent compliance. They carried curious delegates, eager refugees, and wide-eyed merchants from 100 different alien species. They came from the Synthetica system, the deep core sectors, and the farthest reaches of the galactic map. They were not coming to conquer Earth. They were making a peaceful, chaotic pilgrimage to the absolute loudest planet in the known universe. They came to trade, to listen, and to learn how to exist and thrive without a parasitic siphon keeping their souls completely anesthetized. The sudden, catastrophic loss of infinite comfort had forced the entire galaxy to relearn the vital value of friction. The profound, undeniable lesson taught by the Prime Chord was that suppressing the natural world for the sake of temporary convenience is the ultimate form of societal self-destruction. A civilization built on the enforcement of absolute silence is inevitably, mathematically destined to be crushed by the very first honest word spoken. True, lasting harmony does not come from violently muting the chaotic elements of existence. It comes from learning how to build an instrument and play alongside them. Of course, the massive galactic transition was not entirely philosophical and majestic. Elias frequently and loudly complained that the sudden legalization of art had entirely collapsed the black market, permanently destroying his highly lucrative smuggling career. Possessing a vintage acoustic guitar was no longer a capital offense punishable by disintegration. It was the standard, mandatory curriculum in every newly established planetary school. He was tragically forced to become an honest historical archivist, a mundane fate he considered vastly more terrifying than facing an armed execution squad in a cargo bay. Elias reached down into the heavy velvet-lined case resting on the tall green grass beside his boots. He did not pull out the Genesis drive. That ancient heavy cylinder had been safely secured in a new, deeply protected subterranean archive, its digital files freely and continuously broadcast across the newly formed subspace communication networks for anyone with an antenna to hear. Instead, he pulled out the vintage tenor saxophone, the exact same brass instrument that had accidentally cracked the foundation of the Federation on Outpost 73. He ran his calloused thumb over the tarnished silver engraving, feeling the cold, familiar metal warm instantly beneath his touch. He brought the worn mouthpiece to his lips, taking a massive, deep breath of raw, unfiltered ocean air. He closed his eyes and played. He did not play a strict military march, and he avoided perfectly structured, rigid mathematical scales. He played a slow, wandering, and profoundly emotional jazz melody. The sound was rich, heavy, golden, and beautifully, deliberately imperfect. The pure acoustic vibration carried over the steep cliff, weaving seamlessly through the sound of the crashing waves and reaching the alien ships descending gracefully from the sky. Kaylin closed her eyes, letting the physical acoustic wave wash over her skin. She felt the heavy music not as a dangerous biological anomaly, but as the fundamental comforting language of her own newly awakened soul, deep beneath the crust of the revitalized Earth. A dormant, localized resonance faintly echoed back through the soil. It was a quiet, slumbering hum of massive planetary approval. The universe was completely awake. It was entirely unbound, and for the first time in 1,000 years, it was finally ready to listen to the music. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey to the edge of the abyssal shallows and back. If this story of forbidden music, cosmic giants, and the fight for the soul of the galaxy resonated with you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who truly appreciates the power of a great story. I want to know exactly who made it to the very end of this adventure with me. So drop down into the comments right now and leave the word resonance so I can see you. And before you go, make sure you hit that hype button so this video can reach more viewers who love a universe that refuses to stay quiet.